Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Tanner Kroll. I'm the Executive Director of MinnPost. We're a nonprofit independent newsroom serving Minnesota with in-depth coverage of cultural and civic life here in the state. And this is a very special edition of our ongoing social series, partnering and presenting with our friends and partners at Sahan Journal, who are also a nonprofit newsroom providing coverage for and about immigrants and communities of color here in Minnesota. We're very excited to have worked on this project with Sahan and have Joey here for this event. So thanks for being here. As I mentioned, MinnPost and Sahan Journal are both nonprofits. We both rely on reader support. So if you are so inclined and want to get behind our work, you can support Sahan Journal at sahanjournal.com. That's SAHAN journal.com/donate. And for MinnPost, it is minnpost.com/support. We'll get those links in the chat for you. We really appreciate the support you may or may not give either of our organizations currently, and appreciate your support into the future, which makes all of our reporting, including projects like this, possible. We do want to thank our social sponsors who sponsor this series. That's Great River Energy, as well as Darla Cashin at RBC Wealth Management. We appreciate their continued support for these types of conversations and bringing these events to our readers and members. We also want to thank the Institute for Nonprofit News for their support around this collaboration, as well as the funders for the collaboration. That is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, INN's Amplify Network, and the Solutions Journalism Network. So today we're going to be talking about this collaborative reporting project that MinnPost and Sahan did, talking to Latino workers in Minnesota and their experiences through the pandemic and what they've learned through COVID-19. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our editor, Andy Putz, MinnPost editor Andy Putz, who will be moderating the conversation. Andy?
Thanks, Tanner. And I'll just say again, thank you all for joining us today for this this social, which is a little different than the ones we've done in the past, but we're excited to we were excited to do this story with Sahan Journal, and we're excited to have Joey here. So Joey, I'm gonna just get to you first, and we can have Greta kind of chime in here too. But this story that you guys collaborated on, what we're talking today about the disparate ways the pandemic affected Hispanic and Latino workers in Minnesota, was part, as Tanner mentioned, a part of this larger series of stories by nonprofit newsrooms around the Midwest about really the after effects of COVID and sort of, you know, how it was lived in different communities. So I'm curious for you guys, why this story? Why focus on this issue, and what were you guys trying to get into with your reporting?
Yeah, thanks for having me, by the way. I would say that, I'm a health reporter, first of all, and the past year and a half, I've been reporting a lot on how, you know, COVID impacts people's health, right? And pretty much reporting from the perspective of in the patient room, right? This was a chance to really kind of get outside of that and look at more broadly how is COVID impacting, you know, beyond health, society at large, I guess, but looking really at the workforce and working conditions, and how might that impact be long term. The other thing that, the other reason for this was, sure you've all heard the term K-shaped economy. At the beginning of this pandemic, at least speaking for myself, I was kind of assuming there would be a more general downturn overall in the economy, like there was during the Great Recession. But what we saw was some industries really take off and some industries really tank. So this was kind of a opportunity to pick two industries and look at that trend locally. And then finally, we picked Latinos to focus on Latino workers. First of all, because Sahan Journal, our focus is on immigrant and refugee communities. But secondly, Latino population in general in Minnesota is the fastest growing. And I think that translates to the workforce as well. And Greta found some interesting data early on about how Latino workers were the most represented workforce during the pandemic. That's basically they're most likely to stay at work, stay at the job, and not go on unemployment and collect stimulus money. So I think all of those factors were the reason why we chose this focus.
Yeah, Greta, do you want to speak to that and maybe talk a little bit about, that coming across that data and kind of what that meant?
Yeah, so I was talking to Oriane Casal, who's the Labor Market Information Office head at Deed, and she mentioned, I was just kind of like, tell me about like what data that you have on the economy and Latinos in the economy and stuff like that. And she mentioned that if you look at labor force participation rates, which look at the percent of people who are working out of the 16 and older population, Latinos have the highest labor force participation rate in the state. And it actually went up during the pandemic, which, as any of you who have been paying attention to the current kind of workforce issues might know, we've seen labor force participation rate on the whole in Minnesota and around the country go down. So I thought that was really interesting and kind of merited looking at. But then also when it comes to Latinos in the workforce, we were really interested in sort of where Latinos are in the workforce. And of course, Latinos are everywhere in the workforce, in every sector in the industry, but are overrepresented in the restaurant industry and then also the construction industry, which, as we know, are two industries that have, as Joey kind of said, kind of represent that K-shaped recovery where construction businesses have by and large been doing really well, whereas restaurants have really struggled over the last year. So that's sort of, those are things that I found really interesting that made me want to dig more into the story.
And for both of you guys, I mean, was there anything that really surprised you in the course of doing this reporting, or what was the thing that was most kind of interesting to you as you dove into this?
Well, I'd say that we all kind of in the news are hearing about a workforce shortage right now, as in it's hard for employers to find enough people to work the jobs. That wasn't necessarily surprising, but what was, before really digging into this story, I had basically read and assumed that construction, that just wasn't the case. Like, for construction industry, like there's too much work to go around, and everybody who works in it is swamped. But speaking with people like Carla Arcero, who runs the Frida Drywall company, she was telling me that this year she's having to just find people doing drywall jobs. She's having to tap into kind of like migrant workforces, people from Nebraska, people from Texas, to come over here temporarily and work these jobs because she can't find enough people here in Minnesota. And that wasn't even the case, last year, she was saying. So I'd say that was pretty surprising, just to find that, generally we hear construction's doing pretty well, but if you look deeper within it, there are issues like that. Yeah,
and Joey, when you talked to her, didn't she say she had a bunch of openings, and the one that she had a ton of applications for was for like an office worker, which pointed to something that we heard from a lot of people, just that like with the workforce shortage right now and some people being out of the workforce, we're hearing from a lot of different avenues that people are rethinking their relationship with work. And I think it's interesting to hear that on one hand, but you really see kind of signs of it in the data too, where like people have seen their maybe neighbors and friends take their laptop home and work from home. And some people who aren't able to do that in their jobs are maybe thinking like, I would like to be able to do that. So they're looking for more jobs that allow them to work from home and things like that. And we're hearing that from like organizations that help people find jobs and surveys that they do, just that people are looking for more flexible work. People are looking for work that allows them to take care of kids. I mean, we've seen a lot of families have really tricky childcare situations over the last year. And if you think about where we're at right now in the labor market, like kids are home for the summer. So maybe it makes sense that people with childcare needs aren't looking for jobs right now because maybe the economy, maybe their jobs came back a couple of months ago, but they're looking at this whole summer ahead of them where kids are going to be home. So just like the thorniness of the labor market right now has been something that it's not surprising, but at the same time, just like how many different ways it's complicated right now is interesting.
Well, Greta, you've written about the labor market just recently, right? And what were your kind of big takeaways from that? I mean, you touched on some of those things, I think, just now. But was there anything from that story that sort of kind of bridged that gap between the piece you did with Joey and that can sort of talk to more about sort of what's happening?
Yeah, so the big thing that seems like the talk of the town, and like I was hearing this at weekend barbecues, and like everywhere I went, it seems like people were talking about how the extra $300 employment or like unemployment payments, so people who are on unemployment right now are getting an extra $300 a week through early September in Minnesota and a lot of other states. Some states have discontinued that. But hearing from employers that it's more lucrative right now to be on unemployment than to go back to work. Economists will tell you that it's probably a little more complicated than that, but it might prevent some people from going back into the workforce. And that's definitely something we heard from restaurants as we talked to them too, is that they think that their workers are staying home because they're getting an extra $300 a week on unemployment beyond what they would normally get on unemployment, which might in some cases be more lucrative than working in a restaurant. So that's a whole nother issue with the labor market right now. And I think like most of the economists I've talked to about that say, yes, it can be a factor in some cases. Most people who are on unemployment are not making like, you know, so much money, but it is probably smoothing over some of the frictions people had. So some of the things like childcare, like it maybe is buying them time to make decisions about what they want to do next.
And I just wanted to reiterate here that, like, you know, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. You know, you guys have better questions, frankly, probably than I do. So put them in there and we will get to them, I promise. I know this wasn't a big part of the story, but I'm curious to the extent that you guys got any sense of how what you guys studied and what you reported in Minnesota, is the labor market here broadly representative of sort of what has happened elsewhere? I mean, did people say, you know, this is really mirrors what's happening across the country? Is there anything particularly unique about our workforce, and particularly Hispanic and Latino workers in the Twin Cities or in Minnesota?
I guess getting back to when we were talking about the, you know, the trends that people are thinking about, getting back to the construction industry, there seemed to be, just speaking with like business owners, a kind of anxiety that in the, you know, from here on out, office jobs, white collar jobs are going to be what looks desirable, and the type of labor that they do, you know, that construction jobs require is not going to look desirable. You know, I've heard like some of these owners talk about that their workforce is aging, and that, yeah, definitely an anxiety there. You know, I'm not so sure if it mirrors or how it mirrors the kind of overall national trends going on. Greta, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think from what I've heard, what we're seeing here is pretty common. We've seen labor force participation rates drop in the rest of the country too. And it's sort of a question of like, how long until we can get people back to work, and how do we get people back to work and things like that. But it's interesting to see people grapple with this in Minnesota, because Minnesota, among other things it likes to brag about, is that we tend to have really high labor force participation rates. So I think it's like there's a little extra anxiety because Minnesota usually has a fuller workforce and is suddenly seeing people drop out of the workforce and trying to figure out how to get people back in. And we're seeing them throw resources at that. I think Deed is like calling people who are on unemployment right now and trying to figure out like what's keeping them out of the labor force, and like just trying to figure out what's going on in the economy. And I think it's probably too soon to make a lot of broad generalizations about it, just because like we're still coming out of the pandemic. Like surveys of workers show that some people are still worried about like catching COVID at work. People are trying to figure out what to do with their kids. People are, you know, rethinking what they want to do with their life. People are going back to school, and like some of the jobs still haven't come back. And then you also hear things about like pay not being great at some jobs. So there's all these things that are going on, and I'm curious to see what happens in a few months when maybe we're a little further along into the recovery, and if some of these factors have worked themselves out more.
I think the other thing to add, or important point to add, about the anxiety over the 300 extra dollars in unemployment is that, you know, a lot of the workers we spoke with are undocumented, right? And so they did not have access to unemployment, kind of period. So, you know, heard that first of all, from the restaurant owners. You know, we heard that they're having trouble finding people to work, and then hearing from workers that, you know, several of their friends are on that supplemental unemployment, and, you know, have told them like they're just planning to ride it out until it expires in September. So we definitely heard a lot of that in this reporting.
Right, but one of the questions I think it raised too is like, was Latino labor force participation so high and remained so high because like we have a significant number of undocumented people who didn't have the option, and also didn't qualify for stimulus checks in a lot of cases, so didn't receive the same supports that other people who maybe left the labor force did have access to.
Well, Greta, one of the things I know you mentioned when we were just talking about the story, right, is also the paucity of information around and data around certain things. I wonder if you want to just touch on that a little bit as in the course of doing this piece.
Yeah, so when we're talking about undocumented people, the data are always a little more complicated because, say, like undocumented people don't qualify for unemployment. So if we're basing the number of people who are on unemployment in the Latino population on, if we're basing our understanding of unemployment in the Latino population on the number of people who file for unemployment, that's not going to capture people who are undocumented. And then there's all kinds of other situations like that where undocumented people don't show up in the data. And so it's hard to measure these things when it comes to the Latino population, which was why it was really nice to have some time to talk to business owners and to people in the workforce, because these are not things that necessarily always show up in the data, which is a problem for people trying to understand the economy, right?
Yeah. We've got a question in the chat. That's a really good question. So from you guys, are local employers increasing offers to train workers who haven't done the jobs, you know, who haven't previously been trained for jobs that are open and employers want to fill? And the second part of this, is a company health plan an important benefit in terms of enticing people to these jobs? I don't know who wants to take that, but I'll leave that to the both of you.
Well, I can try to answer this in terms of what I hear about from restaurants. And, you know, a lot of these jobs that are vacant are pretty entry level and wouldn't necessarily require training, or at least deep training. So I haven't really, I guess in both cases among restaurants, I haven't really heard of, either of these things happening, offers to train or company health plans. One of the restaurants we spoke with in Egan, I think it's also important to point out that he wasn't able to access both rounds of the PPP loan last year. And, a part of this was because that restaurant owner can't write, and his daughter does all the paperwork for him. So that's one barrier. And the other thing was he had to go take care of something, a family emergency in Mexico, and then came back and missed the second round. But my point is, a lot of these, like in his case, the restaurant pretty much scraped by last year. So I don't think it's sitting on like a lot of reserves or anything to really offer increased benefits to employees right now.
What about in the construction industry? I mean, you do have obviously jobs that, even traditionally people apprentice, there were apprenticeships, there was sort of obviously, there is a level of experience and expertise that people can, train for. I mean, is that a thing that is even happening sort of on the job these days, or at least from what you heard?
I think that's something, it's sort of a general labor market thing, right? That when the labor market's tight, employers tend to offer more training as part of your onboarding process versus like, I think about the 2008 recession when employers could have their pick of employees with experience because there were way more workers than jobs. So it's like, it's the opposite in that respect, but it is like, from what we heard, employers are running into other issues. Like I talked to a contractor who does like rehabilitation after like floods or fires and things like that. And he said, I want to hire more people, but right now, like I have to be like my job, which is supposed to be managing this business. Like right now I'm having to go and be like doing the work because I can't find enough people to hire. So I think they're running into issues like that too.
Yeah. Joey, does that jive with what you heard too?
Yeah, I admittedly haven't heard too much on that topic on the construction side. Yeah, admittedly.
And then with respect to I see the health plan question, and I just haven't looked into that, but I am curious whether the pandemic has sort of renewed focus on having health insurance attached to jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the questions I guess I had for you guys, I mean, both of you have been immersed really in the pandemic in terms of your coverage over the last 15 months. Fingers crossed now that it's winding down, or at least for people who are vaccinated. What are the areas or what are the things that you're looking to explore in your coverage, whether it's frankly related to sort of consequences or lasting impacts of COVID or not, or just things that you kind of put on the back burner while you had to obviously cover, a public health emergency?
Yeah, one thing I was speaking about, like the broader long-term consequences of this COVID-19. One thing I've been reporting on and following right now is this organization called Feeding Our Future, which helps several nonprofits access federal food aid. It's called the Food Program by short, and their battle against the state Department of Education. And the point here is, before the pandemic, this federal program was mostly used by school districts, public school districts, right, to basically feed, kids who need the food. And when the pandemic happened and the schools shut, it opened the opportunity for several nonprofits, after school programs, independent daycare organizations to access this money. And they've been in a long battle, a long court battle with the state. The state has denied a lot of that access more recently. And yeah, that's one thing I'm following as the kind of broader consequence of COVID.
Greta, what about you?
Yeah, so I am really excited to not be covering COVID. Like 90% of the stuff I covered in the last year, I feel like was COVID related or election related. But I am really interested in the like economics of the COVID recovery. So one thing I've been following lately is that we talk about Latino labor force participation remaining high during the pandemic, maybe also marred by some of these issues we have with documenting undocumented people in the workforce, right? But when we look at the same data for Black Minnesotans and then also for women in Minnesota, the labor force participation has gone down. So I'm interested in things like that, as well as just this big question of like, I think the economic recovery is like the COVID economy has been fine for some people, and then for other people it's been really bad. So just kind of following what happens with that into the future is something I'm really interested in.
Yeah, another thing I'm following, I spent a lot of, since the vaccine rollout, looking at vaccine equity, right? And how, for the most part, people of color haven't had the same access to the vaccine as white population. Right now, I'm trying to look at how that's impacting people with disabilities and learning that the state has no real way to track by data what vaccination rates look like for people with disabilities, and how in the disability advocacy community, that's a big problem, right? And yeah, I want to look at where that issue might intersect with immigrant and refugee communities. A little, and then another thing I'm following, sort of unrelated to all of this, is the Department of Justice's pattern and practice investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department, and particularly how one big aspect they're investigating is whether the police discriminated, in a pattern, discriminate against people with disabilities. And I feel like that's getting less attention. And I want to look at how, where that intersects with immigrant and refugee communities as well.
We got a comment in the chat about child care and family health concerns as a major barrier to employment during this unprecedented time, perhaps for state agencies to assist with home family-based childcare. Did you guys run into, I guess my question, just to translating a little bit, did you guys run into that? How childcare and family health stuff impacted obviously the Latino workforce, and sort of how that showed up? Was that a factor in what you guys reported on?
We definitely heard it from people, especially like talking about sort of the intersection of like women in the workforce and then Latino women, like jobs in restaurants, like unpredictable scheduling, like there's all these issues where like it's really hard for women to be in the workforce right now with little kids, plus the expense of childcare. So that's sort of the context. Like, I'd be curious to see what the labor force participation looks like for Latino Minnesotans, like broken into men and women, because I wonder if this recession, this COVID economy has affected women differently than men. But have also been hearing about that in the broader context for sure.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to, this is a little sort of veering a little off topic, but I'm just curious, again, you guys were so immersed in COVID over the last, 15 months. I don't want to, are there stories that you look at that you feel were, what are the stories you look back at now and realize that there were particularly revealing or important? You know, and what were those pieces?
Yeah. So earlier this year, I did a fairly in-depth piece on long hauler, which we've all heard the term long hauler, right? Basically, when somebody gets infected with COVID, has a very severe illness, and it's pretty much life-changing, but they don't die. And that was back, you know, at the beginning of the year. Up to that point, we hadn't, you know, we mostly focused on deaths and infection rates, etc. But yeah, this was a profile of a man named Emilio Gonzalez and his 2-month stay in the hospital, and how he spent time on a ventilator, and how at that point he had just been released, or just been discharged, and was at home, like learning how to walk again and learning how to eat again. I think that, yeah, as time goes on, we're going to learn more about long haulers and more about how the virus, you know, impacts people for the long term, survivors like him for the long term. So I think, yeah, that was important and have opened my eyes to some things. And it's something I want to stay focused on.
Would you say, what do you mean by open your eyes to stuff?
Yeah, just when we, you know, I was there in the hospital for his discharge day, and was in the, you know, in the physical rehab room, and like saw as he was practicing on the walker and fell that day. And it just, you know, I guess you hear about like these people in statistics, right? But like, you know, seeing it right up there, and like the kind of the long haul that he has, long journey that he still had to go. And by the way, I'm hearing he's doing a lot better. Like he's able to walk around. I think he's still on a walker, but walk around in grocery stores and stuff like that. But yeah, just that this was life-changing for him, and then also for the entire family as well. Basically, his daughter was serving as the kind of de facto caregiver, which, you know, that was a situation where he could easily, you know, a home health aid worker would easily be warranted, I think. But, you know, in some cases, you see like family members have to step in and do that work. So yeah.
Yeah, and just so people know, I know we put a link to it, but I can't recommend Joey's piece more highly. Like it's incredibly, it's a great piece of sort of immersive reporting. It's really well done, and really gives you a sense of yeah, that experience. And so it's worth a read. Definitely worth checking out. Greta, what about you?
Yeah, I feel like it's been a whole COVID year, but it really gave us the opportunity. I think at MinnPost, we try to provide context for people beyond kind of the daily news a lot of the time. And it was really an opportunity for me to answer my own questions about the virus, but also questions that I saw people have that were kind of missed in the daily like churn of the news. So like, I just remember really early on in the vaccine rollout, seeing posts on social media from friends and family members in other states who would not be eligible to get the vaccine in Minnesota, but were getting the vaccine other places. And it felt like Minnesota was way behind everywhere else because everyone I knew everywhere else was getting vaccinated. And so just like trying to figure out why stuff like that was happening and what the different rules are. And like, we're really behind everyone else. And like, really trying to put everything into context throughout kind of the entire pandemic, as well as just like explaining things like how mRNA works and things like that were questions that I had, but also questions that readers had, that I think helped us all understand the pandemic better.
I'm going to go back to actually sort of maybe this is going to be a nerdy journalism question. So this may bore the other people to tears, but I'm just curious about this. You guys collaborate on the story. You're from different news organizations. You know, you had a double byline on this. How did you actually, that's a lot more complicated, I think, in practice than it sounds, right? To people. So how did you guys actually do it? How did you split up things? How did you make that work? Because you ended up doing one very big story in the end. And so I'm just curious, like, how did that work?
Well, I spent like a good 3 to 4 weeks, almost, not quite, but almost exclusively on this story. And there was a lot of people that both Greta and I talked with that didn't get in this story. I don't know. I'd say it kind of developed organically. It started out with just me contacting restaurant workers, contacting construction workers. Greta was started kind of with the bird's eye perspective, but also eventually talked to a lot of people on the ground as well. We definitely went through several drafts. Yeah, it was a long process. I would say that, you know, I come from an alt weekly background partially, and have some experience, you know, writing longer, in-depth cover stories, as we would call them. So that definitely helped. But yeah, Greta, what would you have to say on this?
Yeah, I've been doing data stuff at MinnPost now for 5 years. So my first instinct is always like, okay, I got to figure out like what the data landscape is and like what that can tell us about the overall like framing of something. And so I kind of called up the keepers of the data and the people who think about those things on kind of this level to talk to them about what they were seeing, which kind of got us some of those stats, like what the labor force participation rate looks like and things like that, that informed who we talked to on the ground and that kind of thing later. And yeah, I come from a daily newspaper background, so it was helpful to have Joey, who's a little more used to writing long-term projects.
Because originally, at one point, didn't you guys think this was going to be 3 stories?
Yeah, we were kind of thinking about doing like a construction industry one, a restaurant industry one, and then maybe one on just kind of the overall labor force participation stuff. But we realized that like those stories were kind of more interesting in contrast to each other. And if we had 2 stories, people might not read both of them, and some of the context would get lost if they were in separate pieces.
So if you don't mind, I could address some of the stuff that there were some interesting things that came up in this reporting that didn't make it to the story because it was kind of like outside of the focus.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was I spoke to a few restaurant workers, restaurant owners on Lake Street who last year had to deal with first the shutdowns and then the civil unrest and rioting. You know, one person that didn't make it to the story opened his restaurant, you know, inside a Mercado like 1 month before the pandemic. And I don't know how it's still open. It is still open, but yeah, there were definitely things like that came up. Another one was you know, the wife of one of the restaurant owners that I spoke with was apparently, she owns a salon on Lake Street, and apparently he was telling me that she's going to close it down after 20 years because crime in general has just gotten to a point where they don't want to do it anymore. So those issues came up in this reporting as well and are probably worth exploring more, but kind of were outside of the focus of this story.
Yeah, another thing that came up that I thought was interesting while we're on the subject was like Andrew Hazard, who's a colleague of Joey's, and I went to talk to a construction worker, and he interpreted it or did the interview because he speaks Spanish and I do not. And this guy was basically has a company that does carpeting, and he was saying that he had a hard time during the pandemic, which is not sort of the overarching story of the construction industry, and just goes to show you that when you make generalizations, you miss a lot of things. But he talked about how people early in the pandemic didn't want people coming into their house to install carpeting because they were worried about the virus, but then also just kind of some of these bigger issues for a small contractor, where like a lot of the construction that did go on early in the pandemic was these like high-rise buildings that we're seeing going up, and or big apartment buildings replacing carpet and things like that. And he said that the people who develop those buildings or manage those buildings have these people that they work with who do large scale projects, and that made it hard for him because he was looking for work but more like small scale, or just wasn't the person that those companies were calling. He also said that millennials hate carpeting, and that has been difficult for his business, which I thought was an interesting, but also like anecdotally probably true observation.
I'd say one issue that did come up and is touched on a little bit in the story is this issue of wage theft amongst construction workers. And getting a little bit outside here, so we interviewed two people who are undocumented who in the story kind of talk about, you know, their experiences with alleged wage theft. One thing I heard is that it's in construction, it's not limited to undocumented people. Generally, how the allegations I hear how it works is you're a roofer, for example, and you know you're working for a client, putting a new roof on, and in the middle of the project, client will come to you and ask you to do, you know, extra tasks, and then come back and not fully reimburse you for it or what you would charge for it. That's something that definitely came up. Another interesting thing in terms of roofing in particular was the difference between what undocumented roofers will charge for and what, you know, documented roofers would charge for. So in roofing, you charge per square. That's basically 100 square feet of the roof, and the standard rate in general, which we cited and it was confirmed to me by roofers, is somewhere between 100 and on the very high end 300 per square. You know, some of the undocumented roofers we talked to would take jobs as low as $65 a square. And what I've heard, you know, is, you know, part of that's because they're not insured, right? So, which would mean like they'll do a job and the liability would be on the client if anything happens instead of through the company that is doing the work. So anyway, that kind of divided, you know, economy came up, and I think it's worth noting.
We had a comment in the chat, and this might be a question for more political or legislative reporters, but I wonder if either of you can talk, maybe Greta, I don't know if you have any insight to this at all about, you know, there's a comment about what are we hearing regarding whether these and other essential Latino workers who kept the economy afloat but didn't qualify for the federal stimulus and unemployment insurance, if they'll be eligible for the state's $250 million cash bonus program. We did a story actually today just about they're in the midst of trying to figure out who will exactly qualify for this. So the way it's going to work, there's going to be a legislative working group that will kind of come up with a plan. So I think we're kind of in the middle of figuring that out. But Greta, I don't know if you have followed this at all.
Yeah, and thanks, Rosa, for the question. Rosa was one of the people that I initially talked to, trying to figure out sort of what the overarching themes here were going to be for the story. I admittedly haven't been following this specifically because one of our legislative reporters, Peter Callahan, has been. So I don't know what the status is of whether undocumented people will be included, or what the mechanics of that will be when they decide who gets those checks. But I know that that's something that the legislature is currently working on. And I dropped a link to that story in the chat.
Yeah.
I mean, we do know that like last year, like some independent organizations would try to step up and fill the void. Of course, they couldn't match,
Right.
they couldn't match what the federal government was handing out. But
Yeah,
yeah,
Joe,
like,
you talked about that a little bit in the story. I wonder if you want to just expand on that a little bit, because I thought that was a really interesting sort of element.
yeah, that was so the organization called, I think it's the Restaurant Organizing Committee, which is basically a pro labor group, trying to organize immigrant restaurant workers. Last year they had done fundraising and were basically giving out $200 checks to undocumented people who are out of work but could not qualify for unemployment insurance or stimulus. And one of the restaurant workers I spoke with in this story actually did some of that work himself for ROC, and he himself was a restaurant worker who was furloughed 3 months out of a job, or I think longer than that actually. And for a couple months, worked a part-time job for ROC, helping identify those people and sending checks out. We know like other organizations like Partnership Academy, which is a charter school in Ridgefield, attended mostly by Latinos and immigrants. They were getting some money from the city of Ridgefield and helping support some of the families that go to that school with like rental assistance, things like that. But again, like the takeaway was like that none of these could match the amount of money that stimulus was giving out or unemployment insurance.
Yep, I think we want to, one of the things we pride ourselves on at MinnPost is we're going to get you guys out of here when we say we're going to. So unless Greta or Joey, you guys had something else you wanted to mention or wrap it up, you guys can feel free to jump in if you do. Do you? No?
I'm glad we did this story. It was an opportunity to, hear from workers, what the workplace is like, what this last year has been like inside the workplace or outside of it if you were laid off. I didn't really get the chance to do that the year before this, so I'm glad we did it, and it's good to work with all of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say same. And it was good to focus on, I think, like a group of people that aren't always captured in the data and that aren't always talked about when we talk about the COVID economy, and obviously a really important part of the workforce. So
yeah, definitely. And Joey, we'll just say thank you for being participating in our MinnPost social, and obviously thanks to everybody at Sahan Journal for a great collaboration, and you guys were great to work with. Tanner, is there anything you need to come in with to wrap up here?
No, I'll just reiterate our gratitude to Sahan, and also I think Laura will put a link to the chat, actually to the overall collaborative project that involved other newsrooms across the Midwest, looking at life after COVID, that was put together through INN. So I want to thank them for their support and work in putting together this entire kind of umbrella project together. We also have the links to donate to MinnPost and Sahan Journal, and appreciate everyone for being here and for supporting nonprofit journalism here in our state.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thanks.